Okay, good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome back. I do hope you enjoyed your lunch and the connections with colleagues, old friends, new friends. I'm now delighted to introduce Dr. Mary Russell, the CEO of TEQSA, who's going to chair this next panel and introduce what is a really grounded and practical-based conversation. So please welcome the panel. Over to you, Mary.
Good afternoon, everyone. So for those of you who've attended a TEQSA conference in the last couple of years, you will probably recall that we've talked about increasing the ways in which TEQSA can acknowledge and use evidence of a provider's own engagement in self-assurance and risk management. You may also recall that we've talked about the fact that we are reforming and changing some of our regulatory processes so that the provider's narrative about risk management and self-assurance can play an important part in the way that we go about our assessment activities. So over the last year, we've been doing some work piloting how we can bring this approach to our re-registration process. And we're very grateful that a number of providers, some of you in this room, have actually been willing to try something new, share your feedback with us, and help us to look at how we can fine-tune that process so that relying on self-assurance information more is both meaningful and helpful to the provider, but still gives us a good sense of confidence as we go about making regulatory assessments. So the purpose of the session today is, as Braden said, it's very practical. We thought it would be more helpful, rather than you listening at this stage to what TEQSA plans to do, to hear from some of the providers who've been part of that pilot about what their experience of it was in terms of their re-registration, but also what some of it meant as it impacted back into their organisation. So I'm delighted that we have with us today Professor Taryn Jones, who's the Vice-Chancellor of Education at Macquarie University, and Professor Maggie Kappelhoff, who's the Provost of the Sydney College of Divinity. And they've agreed to share a few of their thoughts, but then be brave along with me, and we will frame most of this session around your questions and responding to those as we reflect on what this experience has been and where we plan to take it next. So I'll begin by welcoming Maggie to speak with you. Thank you.
Hello. Yes, I am Canadian by birth and Australian by taxes. So let's just get that out of the way and no one can ask me about the US election. So I joined SCD, or Sydney College of Divinity, in 2022, and my boss, the Dean CEO, started in late 2021. You'll recall in mid-2021 or early 2021 that the provider categories were changing, and at that time, SCD made an application for University College, which was knocked back. And at the time, it felt like a real blow to the provider. But it was a great opportunity to ask the question as to why this had occurred. If SCD had good policies and processes and practices leading to quality assurance and excellence in student support, then what had been missing from their application, or what had they failed to demonstrate to TEQSA in that application process? So my boss and I, when we joined, we took the opportunity to take a good look under the hood at the organization's policies and processes with fresh eyes and all matters related to academic and corporate governance. In light of not just the application, but also in light of the various governing legislative frameworks, TEQSA Act, ESOS Act, HESF, etc. And it was through that process that we discovered that SCD did in fact have good policies and processes. But what SCD had been lacking was the way that they were documenting those policies and processes and the reporting through the minute taking and the reporting cycles and that sort of thing. So it was a good opportunity for us to see that while we did have good holistic quality assurance metrics, we weren't actually documenting that well, and we were able to fix those things. As a result of that work, in July of 2023, SCD was awarded University College. Immediately following getting University College, we went into re-registration and CRICOS re-registration. And throughout those combined applications of University College re-reg, CRICOS, we had some 11 external reviews that had been conducted. So it wasn't just an internal audit of looking under the hood and seeing what was going on, but it was a variety of external experts and consultants who were also scrutinizing SCD and its academic and governance processes and policies, and noting areas of strengths and weaknesses and making recommendations for improvement, which then, of course, brought on a number of implementation plans and actions that had to be followed up by SCD. The end result was that there was a thorough vetting of SCD, internally and externally, which helped to realign and shore up and give confidence to us that we did have a good quality assurance framework with appropriate metrics for self-assurance. And ultimately, we were able to then demonstrate that to TEQSA in our applications, and both accreditations were approved this year with 7 years. Now, let me add that through these processes, we worked very closely with TEQSA, and we were in constant communication as it required. So I'd say that from that experience for us, because nobody ever wants to go through those processes necessarily, there was probably 3 key takeaways for us. For instance, we came up with this helpful phrase, which is, how do you know? So when we were looking at any of our quality assurance metrics or its deliverables, we always ask ourselves, how do you know? How do you know that you're operating as a mature organization and that you have good processes that lead to quality assurance, self-assurance, and best practice? What's the evidence that you're supplying to yourself, in the sector, or back to the regulator? And for example, taking admission in Domain 1, how do you know that prior to enrollment and before fees are accepted, that students are informed of their rights and obligations? What do you do to ensure that you know that? Or when granting credit, RPL, how do you know that students are not being disadvantaged in achieving the expected learning outcomes for their course of study? Often we can assume that if we have a quality assurance framework that we can go through the exercise of just ticking boxes and that therefore it's being met. But we need to remember that it's always our responsibility to know how we know and to ensure that we can always answer that question should we be asked inside or outside of our organization for us to demonstrate that evidence. Following on from that came our second key learning. Within SED, we treat compliance and self-assurance as everybody's business and everybody's responsibility, and as such, we've embedded it across the whole organization and all that we do. From simply increasing awareness through to specific and targeted discussions and training at all levels. In practice and on the ground, it can be as simple as linking the relevant HESF domains and ESOS standards to our policies or to our committee agenda papers, through to actually planned meetings and scheduled agenda items at committees for discussions on a specific domain or standard, including training and staff handbooks and additional professional development for the relevant standards by specific roles within our institution. And because it's everybody's responsibility in business, whenever we have an application or an RFI going to TEQSA, this is led from the top down. Senior leadership take the lead in crafting and drafting that document, and then including the relevant departments and persons in that application process ahead of submission, and then reporting it on to the necessary committees. And finally, our third takeaway was SCD's posture is one of continuous improvements. We all know that compliance and self-assurance is not a set-and-forget framework, but rather it's a quality assurance framework that is always asking the necessary questions during any review or evaluation process. Is this still working? What in the sector has changed? Is our evidence suitable? Are there any new risks to students? And one of the benefits of the how do you know statement is that it also allows you as an organization to consider where you are on that scale of the minimum threshold through to best practice. Now, we know that best practice is where we all want to be, but the reality is that for a lot of these, you may actually be at minimum threshold, and that's okay. And this can happen sometimes for a variety of reasons. A staff member leaves, the sector shifts, a new regulatory requirement is brought out, you add a new program, you change a process over here and inadvertently interrupt the efficacy of a process over there. But if you're continually asking the how do you know question, especially during those review processes, you will be better placed to know where you are on that threshold between minimum thresholds and best practice. And once it's identified, it can be addressed. And the pathway to get there is this posture of continuous improvement. So again, for SCD, while we might not have chosen the university application to get knocked back or the 11 external reviews in 2 years with multiple implementation plans, it was a great opportunity for us as an organization to reassess, reset, realign, restructure, and address issues, which now gives us the confidence to state that we are a mature organization with good self-assurance practices, and we still have room to grow through continuous improvement. Thank you.
Thanks, Maggie. Now, as an educator, when I thought about this session, I was thinking what would be most useful for you as my metaphorical students to maybe learn from me and the experiences that we had at Macquarie University. And so rather than sort of going through our experience in detail, I thought I'd pick out some key tips or messages that may be useful for those of you that are needing to go through this journey yourselves. The first thing I would say, and this is the beauty of self-assurance, is that context matters. What self-assurance allows us to do is to situate how we work with the regulations within our own institutions. So the first thing I would say is tell your story. Put it within the context that is meaningful for your own institutions. Because as a group, we're very large and diverse in our nature. The way we may use one policy lever at one institution may not work at all at another institution, or maybe it's not even needed because the institution is smaller in size and can do something quite different instead. So I would say definitely tell your story and demonstrate within that unique context how you respond to the regulations and ensure the assurance that you need to. The other thing I would say is this is definitely a team approach. As Maggie said, senior leadership really matters, and being led right from the top is really important. But it's certainly not a one person or an isolated siloed team that can put a proper submission for re-registration together or can situate all of those things that need to happen on a daily basis to prove that you are in line with the regulations. So we had a very structured, while there was people working on this endlessly for a long period of time, what was really key was how the senior leadership then engaged with subject matter experts that were able to put the various regulations within the context of their space and their area to ensure that we had full coverage across the institution. So really think about building that team and engaging on a regular basis to make sure that you're timing the submission really, really well and are crossing off all areas. The other thing, and I think this is where the planning for this really matters, and what really is important about self-assurance is that it's not a one-time test that we tick off and then forget about for another 7 years, or maybe 6 years if you want a bit of planning time to do your submission. What TEQSA is really looking for is things that are systematised and embedded, where quality becomes part of the everyday fabric of the institution. And so it's a little bit, again, like we want our students to really engage in deep learning and to not just simply memorise things to pass a test. So the same is the case with compliance and regulations. What the re-registration does allow you to do sometimes, though, is do the little bit of the heavy-handed kind of push. It's like we use assessment to try and gauge learning in the direction we may want it to go. It certainly was a useful tool for us to be able to push through some things that we really thought were needed. So a good example for us was in the course review space. Course reviews were happening at Macquarie in a little bit of of a haphazard fashion. There were some courses that were reviewed really regularly as part of professional accreditation processes and the like, and there was sort of a review process loosely in place. But what we felt was that was not something that was of the level that we really thought would be needed to show best practice. So what the re-registration process did allow us to do was to implement a stronger suite of life cycle policies across the sort of various stages of the curriculum that allowed for both monitoring and course review processes. And to embed, and this was mentioned in the session earlier today, the cultural change that sat alongside those. Because that was something that a lot of our academic and professional staff hadn't engaged in fully before. And so using the kind of the TEQSA re-registration as an impetus allowed us to really put into place something that was best practice and was led very strongly by senior leadership coming down. And is now, whilst the first year was definitely a challenge to herd people along the journey of those that hadn't done this and all of the work that's associated with really deep course and curriculum reviews. What it did allow us to do now, a couple of years further down the track, is that's just BAU, and all of the sort of the noise that came with the first embedding of that process just disappeared and went away, and it's now just part of our everyday fabric. When it comes to the submission itself, I think the other thing is it is a space where less is more. So I think it's about, when you're preparing that submission, how can you truly show that you've got something systematised, embedded, and with the evidence, whether it's quantitative and or qualitative, to demonstrate that that process has maturity and is working. But it doesn't mean that you have to bombard TEQSA with everything. And that was a very important part. So bringing the evidence to those parts, to those examples rather, that really show key points that you're trying to make is really important. And I think a key point, and it links to my final point that I'll use to wrap up, if TEQSA needs more information, they will ask, and that's okay, because then you just produce more evidence to sort of demonstrate. So don't feel that you have to throw everything at it, because I think that can sometimes really muddy the waters and actually take away from the key messages that you're trying to impart. It's a little bit like, you know, it's that high distinction kind of assignment that's really clear and easy to read, and you just know exactly what the student is trying to say to you. It's very much the same sort of approach that we want to take in this space. And my final point, and I think this is a really crucial thing, and we learnt this through, similarly to Maggie, where we had a less than desirable outcome on a piece of work that we'd done previously. So when we'd submitted our CRICOS re-registration before we had to submit for our TEQSA re-registration, and TEQSA had come back quite rightfully with some requests for some more information in a few areas. Through that process, the first thing we wanted to do was really understand exactly what they thought we were missing and where they thought we were maybe not showing them what they needed to see. So it commenced a much closer working relationship with the regulatory body. And we were able then to kind of understand where there was maybe some miscommunication that we were providing and where we genuinely had a little bit more work to do, and they could work with us to create, and we provided more evidence, and CRICOS went through very smoothly following that process. So learning on from that, in the lead up to this, we did develop a very close working relationship with TEQSA to understand what it was that they were after, to ask questions if we thought something needed a little bit more clarity for us to ensure that we were meeting what it was that they expected from us. I think through that becomes a heightening of trust. You know, they get to know us, we get to know them. There's a relationship built that builds transparency in the processes. It's certainly something I think we can see when regulations are well considered and put into place and the regulatory authority develops that trusting relationship, it's where things can really work well. It's certainly, I think, something that we have to consider in this time where we feel like the trust isn't necessarily there and we don't have that open dialogue with some other agencies that we're needing to work with. But I think certainly it is a place where those things are well situated, we can have a really good outcome. So that would be my other key point. Thank you.
So thank you both, Taryn and Maggie. I think what I like about those accounts is it shows at a high level how the principles of the process can play out differently according to the type of organisation, the type of teaching and learning and research that you undertake. So we have some questions. There's a lot of interest in understanding what you would both say the new self-assurance process is like in terms of the time and resourcing that it takes. Was it more intensive but more useful or something else?
Yep, I can start. I don't know that I can provide a very good answer because we'd actually prepared under the old system, and at the 11th hour and 59th minute, literally, were given the option of moving to this process and altering our submission to address it. So I guess I would, so we did have quite an intense move to that, but I think it produced a much better submission. But I think either way, it was actually the work that was done in the lead up to the process that was actually the important part rather than the submission itself, because that's where all the work was done to review policies and procedures and embed a really regular cycle of that in a way that, again, was just much stronger than we'd had before. It was about looking at where our gaps were, looking at where we needed the cultural influences to kind of change and happen, and to put into place a much more overt, and you spoke to this, Maggie, a much more overt way of demonstrating that that's happening. So, making that much more obvious when things were being looked at in this way through Academic Senate, for example, and through Council. So I think it was all that work that was important.
Okay, good, Son. For us, because we had just come out of the university college application process, and because we had the 11 reviews, as I said, over that period of time, we had a plethora of information. And we knew that and we thought one of the reasons why our application on university college had failed previously is because the approach that had been taken was a submission of 2,000 pages. So when we approached it, we're like, we're not going to do that. We're going to take an executive summary for each section that we need to report on. We're going to say what we need to say in just that short, succinct, cohesive statement. And then we're going to supply an index with a list of information that they can draw from should they require it. And with my name at the bottom saying, if you want any more information, just come back to us. We'll gladly come and give you anything that you desire. So for us, I think we were so embedded in the process, and because I hadn't been part of a re-registration before under the old process, so just so you're clear there as well, so I don't have that depth of experience, but we were already so embedded in just compiling our information and creating our narrative and understanding where our gaps were and identifying those gaps and fixing our documenting issues that it really made it, we were well versed. It made it easy to provide an executive summary and to just give the bits of information.
Thank you. I'm interested in the observations that you've both made about the fact that the first time that this process sort of drew your attention to how you're embedding self-assurance, it was more work. There was a lot of activity, there was more that needed to be done. I guess one of the reasons that at TEQSA we're adopting this approach is because getting to that point of maturity and getting that embedded at BAU should mean that the type of information that we are ultimately looking for is the same type of information that you'd be providing internally, as you've said, to academic board, to Senate or your governing body. And so over time, as that maturity happens, it really should mean that the burden of providing that same information to us as the regulator is far less because you're already collecting it, already using it for self-assurance. Before I go to another question, can I just, people may not be aware that part of what is submitted now is a provider self-assurance statement, which is essentially a narrative that sort of sets out your self-assurance activities and position, the things that you're really working on, and as Maggie has said, shows us the type of evidence that you're relying upon and we can call on from TEQSA. Is there anything you'd like to add about the process of preparing the self-assurance statement?
I think it comes back to what I'd sort of said before. I think it's important that you situate it within the context of your own institution, because that matters. And so it does allow, I think that's the beauty of that approach, is that it allows recognition that what works for one provider may not work for another. So I would certainly emphasise that and the importance of that. And I think, that's probably the key thing that I would say. I think succinct, as you've stated, Maggie, is best. Clear, succinct, address the key things that you're asked to address. Don't add the extra noise. And the evidence, I think, is also important as it moves through the submission, because I think you can provide the evidence that best examples a particular point that you're making, but recognising that evidence may also support somewhere else. And the diversity of evidence can be quite useful across the submission as well. So I think that would be the other key thing.
And transparency. Don't fluff it. Don't make up stuff just to cover up things. This isn't a test where you have to get 100% or else you lose. This is a demonstration of you as an institution saying, this is what we're doing, this is where we're getting it right, this is where we're getting it wrong, this is what the external review revealed to us, and this is where we're planning on actually putting other processes in place. And then when is your review cycle coming after that? It's great that you put something in place, but it's not the set and forget. We got to come back to it at some point in time and go, is it working?
And just, I suppose, on that too, I think sometimes problems can actually be useful examples. I think it was Professor Krauss had mentioned the engine metaphor before, and I think it's quite useful here if we think of extending that. We want to ensure that regular maintenance is done, but we also want to assure that our car tells us when there's a problem and alerts us to where that is, and then gives us notice in time that we can then do something to fix it. So that's proof of maturity in itself. So a perfect submission doesn't have to have perfect stuff happening all over. We're a large and complex organisation. Things happen. It's catching it that is important.
And I will say for the third year running that if you tell us everything's fine, there's nothing to see here, that's not reassuring to a regulator. Okay, we've got some great questions here. So, Maggie, perhaps if you can speak to this one. What are the most common gaps in self-assurance and what's commonly not happening that should be? What was your experience?
I think for us, what we found was the common gap was just our communication cycle. So we are an established, long-running institution with a group of consortium colleges that all make us up as a body, an organization, and sometimes there weren't a lot of movements from the institute, from our member colleges, so people have been around for a long time, so they know things by osmosis. And when they know things by osmosis, they don't often come back to the policy or what the reporting cycles are actually saying within the policy, and therefore they aren't bringing the deliverables for that. Or sometimes because, again, everybody knows everybody and this, that, and the other, people get complacent. So rather than running it through a committee, they send an email. And then that's fine if it's an out of session because it needs to be handled that way in this moment because there's a deadline coming up and some urgency, fine. But you still have to bring that documentation back into the committee cycle so that way it can be reported through. And again, for us, 7 years from now when we go through this process again, there will be simply a list of things that we can just pull together and send. It may be the same application, warning you right now.
On top of that, I completely agree with those. I would say consistency is really important, and I think that's, as I sort of mentioned before, we had things happening, we just didn't always have them happening as consistently as a regulatory authority would like us to. So that was a really important gap, I think, to fill, and that's been a really important step in making sure that the consistency is maintained. And along with that communication, I think it's also an education piece. Certainly many of our colleagues are not so aware. I know in the academic workforce, the majority of academics actually don't have a fantastic understanding of how universities are governed and the sort of regulations that have to acquire. So there's a big education piece that has to bring the why to why we're doing things in certain ways. And that's something I think I see that as still some maturity in that space that we need to embed, even at the most junior levels.
And hence just sticking the HESF and domains and ESOS Acts on policy papers and things like that, it just creates that level of awareness.
Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to say about common pitfalls when you're transitioning from a more compliance-focused mindset to one of self-assurance?
Okay. Well, I guess the common pitfall is that complacency, and I think it's the belief that it's somebody else's business. Compliance at our institution is everybody's business. Self-assurance is everybody's business, and it's everybody's responsibility as well. So I think you can't just say, "Oh, we've got a quality assurance manager. That's what they do." And they put it over there. You do not operate in silos at an institution, from your academics to your student services to your governance, academic and corporate or otherwise. It's a system that runs best together when it's integrated and when there's enough overlap and not too many gaps in that process, so you can see it from start to finish. So I think that was a pitfall, is that complacency or thinking it's somebody else's job. But I can't think of any. Was there
I
something
would
else?
probably say, building on from that, is not falling into that set and forget either. So not just the complacency, but I think responding, and at the moment, there's so much kind of flying around and coming at us that the policy levers or processes and procedures will constantly need to be tweaked in order to get to the right setting to ensure that we're continuing to meet the requirements that we need to meet. So I think that's the process of self-assurance, is making sure those settings are kind of constantly in line with where we need them to be.
Thank you. I'm going to let you answer the next question first, and then I'm going to add something. So the question is, how is TEQSA supporting its staff and external experts in completing an assessment of a re-registration application under the new self-assurance process? And the reason I want to ask you is that you don't seem too traumatised, given that the process is new, and as part of piloting this, it's been a process of helping us to understand what sort of guidance and information is needed.
Yeah, I can't speak for Heather Sainsbury, who probably had a more traumatic experience than I did. Heather, wherever you are. There you are, thank you, who did lead on the submission. Look, I guess it was what I expected of it, to be honest. I've had experience with accrediting bodies in my disciplinary area and done professional accreditation. It was very much in line with that approach, and I think, and because we had gone through the CRICOS experience, as I'd mentioned, that was a wee bit traumatic for a little while, but all good in the end. And so I think the relationship that we had was by then one of much greater trust, and it was fairly evident that it wasn't a gotcha culture that was in place, and so the transparency, the trust was there, and so and we trusted that if more information on anything was needed, it would be requested, and that wasn't a negative thing. So I think it was that trust that was really key.
I can't speak to internally how the staff at TEQSA were supported, but we do know in the sector that the regulator's overburdened with the amount of applications and processes that they've got to work through, and that they're trying to create and streamline some of their processes for more efficiencies. So we already knew that was there, and that was, I guess, part of the approach in our application as well, is that we wanted to make it succinct and coherent and easy to understand, like that HD assignment that you put in, because we knew that it's just going to be better for us in the long run if they can get a clean application and easy and straightforward to follow. And so, I mean, this is going to sound crazy, but make sure you don't have any spelling errors. Punctuation, formatting, the same typeset, for the love of God. I mean, it's like there's just some things that you can do that just makes your application and your documentation just looks so much better. And that's just going to help your application along and then take some of the burden off. And I think so. For me, whenever I think I've never waited more than 2 or 3 days for an email back from anybody at TEQSA if I needed something. And I think that's pretty darn good.
Thank you. So, look, it's good to hear your experience of that. I think, though, that it's worth calling out that there are some changes in this approach, both for TEQSA and for providers. So the first one that I think both our presenters have referred to is that this approach moves away from the idea of submitting a whole lot of information to TEQSA and then just waiting to hear back, like to hear an outcome. So, it means that instead of collecting enormous amounts of information at the front end of an assessment and then for you wondering what TEQSA do with that, it's a much more succinct application process, but you should expect, and it's perfectly normal, that we will come back and ask for more. So it means that it's more compact, more succinct, and it's a starting point for an iterative process through the assessment. So that is different. For us, there's been also a commitment to both hearing a lot of feedback from providers and understanding their experience, but also making sure that we have confidence in provider self-assurance as a way of guiding our regulatory decisions. So we've, in the background, we've done a lot of workshopping with staff, we've done workshopping with commissioners, we've done moderation processes to make sure that we are looking for the same indicators, we're coming to the same conclusions, we're identifying, consistently the type of information that is needed to make sure that we've got some of that reliability about the way that we're assessing and using that information internally. Many of you will also know that tomorrow we are conducting a workshop with representatives from almost all providers, which is really exciting for us, to pilot some of the new work that will support revisions to our risk framework. And we will be using the feedback that we get tomorrow to finalise a consultation draft to share with the sector. So we are in the process of pulling together some of the supporting documentation about what this means in the changing way we are looking at risk and self-assurance as part of our regulatory process in a way that should be useful for providers and give much more transparency about how we undertake the assessment process. The only other thing I'll say about experts is that I think it will change the way that that providers use experts. So when a self-assurance and a mature self-assurance approach becomes business as usual, you need different things from experts. It provides you with the opportunity to be much more targeted and focused if you're commissioning an external review. So it's not tell us if we're complying with the standards. It's we've done this work in the past, this is what we've been doing to address an issue, what's an external view about the progress on that, or it's something that the terms of reference are scoped to address something that is particularly relevant risk or a particularly relevant area for your self-assurance. So I think that and that can be captured in the self-assurance statement. So it really, once again, allows you as providers to sort of say what is most relevant for us to understand and have some independent eyes look at and give us some feedback, or to use some benchmarking to secure. So, you can be more discriminating about that and commission that sort of work in a way that adds to what you're already doing. The only other thing that I would say is to caution any provider about having an external consultant write your self-assurance statement. I think, we are not expecting perfection, but we are expecting to see that the people in the organisation who have the responsibility for managing risks and for doing the self-assurance can share the story and narrative. That shouldn't be something that you outsource. You need to give us your honest narrative about that. And this is, as you've called out, it's not a gotcha sort of culture, but what we want is to see that you're finding issues, you're managing risks, and you're dealing in a really active way with what you find, and then you're you're checking, how do you know that you're making progress? Okay. We have 5 minutes. So there's a question about what changes are needed to guidance notes and tools for the sector. So as organisations that have been through this, I'm interested to hear your view.
On the TEQSA guidance.
Yep.
I think, as TEQSA says regularly, the guidance notes are not, this is exactly the formula that you need to run. And you've talked about context, and that's so incredibly important. I remember one of our, well, we've gone through a few of these, but we've even had some external reviews who said that our academic board needed to be representative of all of our member institutions and this, that, and the other. And we debated that as a recommendation within our institution, and we rejected it. We said, no, our academic board needs to actually have the expertise that we require from the sector for the areas where we actually have some gaps for ourselves or blind spots that we need to bring in. So I think, and same thing with the guidance notes. The guidance notes point you towards how something should be structured and shaped, but you have to bring it to the context of your institution, and you have to benchmark as to what similar institutions are doing, so you know that you're delivering a similar deliverable to the students or to the policy, and that you're identifying the risk for your own context. I think that's a really important key. We, as a religious institution, have different risks than some other institutions will have. And, but they also have different governing structures through their own diocese or this, that, or the other in terms of codes of conduct that we have to then sometimes marry up and bring back in together. So it's a bit of a complex situation. So if we were to simply try to follow the guidance note and create, like, it's just a template, stamp, 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 cookie cutter, it's not going to work. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the guidance notes are very useful for really clarifying what it is that you're meaning by certain terms, or making it really clear what it is you're looking for. I think moving to self-assurance, and it almost makes me a wee bit nervous because I don't want it to look like these are the checklist of but I think examples can be useful as, forms of evidence. Examples of those can be very helpful, I think, in supporting a provider to think about what might be useful kind of thing. But it's just making sure it's clear that they are just examples and that you may not have any of those in place. It might be something completely different that is able to speak to it. That's probably, I've seen that quite well utilised within professional accreditation documents where it's been a sort of a similar approach to this, and that's been quite a helpful sort of double check of sort of going, have I got all of the things in place? So that would probably be quite useful. I think there's certainly, as I mentioned, the definitions are going to be really important, and particularly as we're ending up with sort of more and more regulatory kind of bodies around us, the lenses are all kind of different. So I think making sure we're keeping a context on what it is that each of the authorities is trying to understand from us is probably really key. So shaping the notes in that way.
Thank you. And I'm going to choose one really practical one as the last question. And Maggie, I'll put this to you. Can you explain the importance of minutes as a source of truth and evidence of discussions, oversight, and how we know what's going on?
Yeah, so minutes are the place where, so who was it in one of the sessions, they said you can't just send something through to your boards or committees and have it on the agenda and then have it as noted. And just like, oh, receipt, received, as a passive receipt. That's what I think the terminology was in one of the sessions. You don't just receive these things as a passive receipt. They're a point of engagement, and they're a point of consideration. So in terms of the minute taking within that space, yes, document that. Don't just say the committee received the report and discussed. I mean, what did they discuss? Did they find any issues with the report coming in? Did they notice any trends? Was there any points of concerns? Was there any items for follow-up that's required? Now, sometimes there will be a report that's received, and it's like, this is just stock standard report with nothing to see here, and you might include that. But on some of these bigger ticket items, you really got to be considering, like for example, when we send a HESF domain through to our council or through to our academic board or one of our other committees, we discuss the HESF domain, what it actually says, what are some of the criteria within it, where it links into our relevant policies and procedures, what are some of our deliverables from the terms of references from our various committees. So it's a discussion point, it's an engagement point, it's a learning experience, and then through that sometimes we know when the policies got to be reviewed again, or if there's been a sector change that we need to identify a new issue, or we've identified a new issue that we need to follow up on. So that's, I think, how minutes work for us.
Great, thank you. There will be more conversations on this over time. There's a sort of a cultural and practical change, not only for TEQSA but also for providers in this. But we really look forward to engaging with that with you in the spirit of consultation and dialogue and ongoing learning and improvement. So please join me in thanking Maggie and Taryn for sharing their experience today.
Thank you very much, Mary and Maggie and Taryn, for a really helpful and insightful conversation about how you do some of the practical elements of this. I'm now delighted to introduce our next panel. We're going to be exploring the perspectives of the real student experience. So I'm going to invite them up. So we've got Lisa Bolton, the Director of QILT Research and Strategy at Social Research Centre. We then have Ngaire Bogemann, who's the NUS President. We have Kathleen Nelly, the Australian Centre for Student Equity and Success Advisory Board member, as well as Professor Kylie Readman, DVC Education and Students. Now, before you welcome them, what I'm going to ask you to do, because I'm an annoying high school educator, if you're able, can you just stand up for me? And now I'm all about the student experience, and so what I'd like you to do is raise your left hand for me. Okay, now raise your right hand for me. Now wave and welcome our wonderful students. Don't worry about Kylie, she doesn't need a welcome, she's fine. What we're going to do is we're going to ask Lisa to give us a run through of the latest on SES, and I hope you just enjoyed a bit of moment to stand up, to run us through some of the latest data in the SES, and we're going to use that as a reflection point for the rest of the conversation. So can you please welcome Lisa to take us through? So give Lisa a round of applause.
Slides. It'll surprise no one. I have slides, too many slides. It's my thing. But I'm devastated I don't have the Britney Spears headset, so that's limited my interpretive dance component of the presentation. I've got a, is this my thing? Do I press something? The green button? Oh, nope. Yes? Oh, look at that. So some people will have noticed the Student Experience Survey national report came out just recently, but institutions have had this data going back to January. It's a big survey. It's like turning the Titanic. You'll see 142 participating institutions, that's all 42 universities and 100 non-university higher education providers. The non-university higher education providers have been keen as mustard and participating fully in QILT. It's just been a joy to see. But you can see we get about 250,000, 300,000 responses per year. This is a lot of students filling in these surveys and telling you what they think. A survey can't be everything. This is just a suite of 4 surveys. It doesn't measure everything. It has all of the limitations that surveys have, but it's an important indicator for how you're going. So I won't say that it's everything, but certainly 183,000 students saw fit to put comments in the best aspects and areas that need improvement. And this is an area I think that institutions are underutilising. Your students are speaking to you. They've taken the trouble to do these surveys. They've taken the trouble to write comments. And a lot of the comments are just fabulous, real constructive comments. So you'll see I've just popped those, you know, bit of a graph there. It's not really a line thing, but looks all right. But you'll see this is a survey that can respond to what's happening in the sector. So you see that big dip in 2020 after the response to the COVID pandemic. And that was driven mainly by students who had expected an on-campus internal experience that had been pushed into online study. International students, that was an even bigger drop because they're much more sort of reliant on the higher education campuses for their cultural needs, for their social needs, for their equipment, their study spaces. They really took a hit over that time period. 2021, some recovery. Again, a lot of places still in COVID mode, but we saw that international students, nearly a third of them were stuck overseas, and they were stuck overseas. That's not where they wanted to be. But we see in 2022, 2023, it's starting to recover. And I can tell you that it's recovered more strongly for international students than for domestic students. And part of that is that return to on-campus where that's their expectation. External students don't expect to come on campus, and so there was nary a blip over COVID. But for students who are looking for that broader experience, that's where we saw that drop. We've seen some recovery, but it's not back to where it used to be. And if we were asking Lisa, the person at the front, rather than a statistician, some of that's due to hybrid. How much hybrid is too much that a student starts behaving like an online student? How much of that on-campus experience is integral to their learning? So then, this basic correlation, it's nothing exciting statistically, but I just ran what are the items that are most highly associated with the overall educational experience. It will surprise no one that the teaching items are right up there. So this is the top 20. But I've put a little box around it. Sense of belonging, which has been in the survey since the beginning, was in the old graduate destination CEQ questions going back to when Adam was a boy. It rates number 7 in that top 20 list of things associated with the overall experience. Sense of belonging is an important aspect if we use that as a kind of a corollary, can't say it. So the student's sense of belonging, it only sits around 50% on a good day of students are saying, I felt a sense of belonging to my institution. Again, it surprises no one. For external students, that's lower. But there are other groups where that's lower. So students from, I'll call you newies, it's my nice term for non-university providers. Newies, it's higher, that level of engagement. Have a tendency, some of them, to be more on campus, but also smaller, more mission-focused. I think we've had some speakers today talk about that. It's easier to engage students when you're all on the same mission. You're all on the same page and you know who they are. It's a two-way communication, not a one-way communication. Domestic students, international students, higher sense of belonging, again, more likely to be on campus, to be engaging on campus, and they like to come. They like to meet Australian students. They like a diverse group. And internal students have a higher sense of belonging than external. So students who are studying online, it's much harder to foster that sense of belonging. So for students with a disability, it's easier for them to engage maybe from home on their computer in the middle of the night with a can of Coke. But are they engaging with other students? Are they meeting people who are other able-bodied students, for example? And are those students meeting students with disabilities? Is this not something important? In a world of social anxiety, how are we teaching students to engage with other people if they're studying mainly in an online context? So for sense of belonging, I did that same, it's basic correlations, nothing exciting. But you can see the quality of the overall educational experience is the biggest thing that it relates to, but it relates as well, you can see, where's my colour there, induction and orientation activities. Institution brokered activities that get students to meet each other. During COVID, a lot of the comments was death by death by Zoom. I'm going to steal that slide. But that was exactly what students were saying. No one shares their picture. I don't know any of these people. I understand group work is important. I've got 4 group work assignments in 4 subjects, sometimes 8. And they don't know their peers. Who am I going to go in a group with? I don't know these people. They don't put the cameras on. So how are they getting that engagement with their peers and that engagement with the academic staff that they're looking for? We also have the item about seriously considered leaving, about 18, 19, 20%. It's always been about that. But certainly we see that the reasons why they seriously considered leaving are around things like mental health, stress, and those kind of things. It used to be that about half of the people who'd considered leaving said health or stress, so we broke them out. We've now got mental health, physical health, and stress, and still it's mental health and stress as the top 2 issues that they raise. She says... Now, little thing here, one of the strengths of QILT is that institutions can get together and write modules that they can add to QILT, and we use the QILT infrastructure to push those out. So after the review of the Student Experience Survey in 2023, we invited the institutions, because they were saying, where's the wellbeing stuff, to design something with us, and we've now delivered that for 2 years for institutions that are interested to participate. It's a fee for servicing, and we give the institutions all of that information back. They get a Tableau thing, etc. So one of the components of that is the Personal Wellbeing Index, which was developed by an academic out at Deakin. And what we see is that students with a positive sense of belonging, the ones who said, yes, positive sense of belonging, were more likely also to have given a higher wellbeing index score. And I've put the things underneath, standard of living. It's the outside stuff about how they feel about their life. But we can see some relationships there. But we can also see those relationships for LGBTQI plus students. They were scoring lower on that wellbeing index. Non-binary students scored much lower in those measures. But it's a small group, so I didn't stick a thing on there. But it's a small group, but it's an important one. Students with a disability too scored lower on all of those indicators. And if we go to my favourite bit, we also asked them about their level of stress. How stressed are you? How are you coping with that stress? And how do you feel the institution is supporting you to deal with that stress? And so what we have here is people with a positive sense of belonging were less likely to say that they were experiencing stress, and I've given you the scale there, quite a bit or very much. Also, their ability to cope with that stress was not as strong as for students who didn't feel. Confused myself. And then institution support. You can see those people who don't have a positive sense of belonging also are feeling that they're not as supported with their stress. I've just dumped in another one, which is for people considered leaving. And there's a big differential there about how stressed they feel, how well they feel they're able to deal with their stress, and also how supported they feel by the institution. So I think in that wellbeing module, there's some real interesting stuff for institutions to be looking at and taking on board, particularly for certain equity groups and others. There's another question that I haven't got a slide for, but Braden made me think about. So there's one question in the freedom of expression set, which is, I'm free from discrimination, harm or hatred at my institution. Overall, about 81% of students agree or strongly agree. Now, the tragedy is this is a 5-point scale, so it has the evil neither agree nor disagree. So that does not mean that 20% disagreed, which some people have tried to say. In fact, it's closer to about 5% of students disagreed. And when we break that down, students, First Nations students, students with a disability, LGBTQI plus students, non-binary students, are much more likely to say they disagreed with that statement, that they were not free from harm, discrimination, harm or hatred. I know it's a triple banger, don't ask me about it. And students who'd considered leaving and those who didn't have a positive sense of belonging also. That was less positive. So I was just raising those things for the room. But I'd like to say talk to your students, find out from them what's happening. Your context is important. But here we have 183,000 students who've provided their feedback in writing. You've got 250,000 students who've taken the trouble to fill out these surveys. It's not the only indicator about how you're going, about quality, but I think it's an important one. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. You can have your notes back, Lisa, just in case there's anything super important. Thank you very much, Lisa, for that kind of overarching view. It's really helpful to delve into the student experience. And Ngaire said to me, there's not there's multiple student experiences, and we're going to delve into some of that. So I'm going to start with you, Ngaire, if that's okay. If you could just introduce yourself and who you're representing and what university you're at, what you're studying potentially. And then I want to get your reflections from a student leadership point of view. What are you observing across the sector in terms of the ways in which universities are meeting students at where they're at? So I'm just interested in your reflections on that.
Hello. Oh, sorry. I feel like I'm about to do stand-up comedy with you all. Don't worry, I'm not going to do that. Hi, my name's Ngaire Bogemann. I am the president of the National Union of Students, and also I'm actually a fourth-year art student at the University of Melbourne. I think that data is really interesting and there's a lot to unpack within it. The first thing I'll say is it shouldn't shock anybody that students have opinions on where they study. And it shouldn't shock people that they want to talk about it and they want to provide constructive feedback. Because the reality is students want to study in an environment where they're heard, where they're comfortable, where they enjoy it. Nobody wants to have a bad time doing anything, and students are not an exception to that. To sort of focus in, I think, on that sense of belonging piece, I found that really interesting, and it's one that I think is very emblematic of, I think, some of the key issues and stresses we are seeing across higher education from a student perspective at the moment. For a lot of young people, and I'm sure everybody in this room can relate, the struggles are, eating 3 meals a day, putting a roof over your head, and somehow also fitting in your degree around that. Students aren't some sort of abstract concept. Everybody in this room was a student at some point. You can all relate to the experience of being a student, and I'll be honest with you, the experience you probably had as a student isn't remarkably different to the experience of a student today. An example of that is the NUS has existed since 1987. Since 1987, we've been campaigning for youth allowance to be increased. So that gives you an example of just how enduring some of the key issues in the sector are. Beyond that, when you talk about a sense of belonging, the key issues impacting students, housing, cost of living, these are keeping students away from campus where they can develop that sense of belonging. We know there was some data that came out from the Department of Education earlier this year that showed this year, I think since 2022, there was the highest level of university dropouts since record began in 2005. And the number one reason students are dropping out is because of the cost of living and financial pressures they're facing at the moment. Students are finding it hard to develop a sense of belonging and a sense of well-being at higher education because of the pressures they're facing not on campus but outside of campus. More students now than ever are having to reduce their course loads to work so that they can eat, so that they can put a roof over their heads. I'm one of them, that's why I'm a fourth-year student. These are the sorts of issues we need to start thinking about and talking about within the higher education sector. I think a lot of university management sort of and scratch their heads and think, oh, but we've got food stores on campus and we run free events every week. Why don't our students love us? Why aren't they so happy? Sausage sizzle, yay. The reality is the majority of students probably didn't come to that sausage sizzle because they were at work. The vast majority of students probably aren't able to stick around on campus after their classes because they have to go off, and work a shift so that they can pay their rent and eat. That is the lived, experience and reality students are facing today, and that's, I think, what we need to be a bit more cognizant of. Students aren't immune to the cost of living and housing crisis that every single Australian in this country is facing. And just because, in the past and even now, we normalise to an extent student poverty, and we think it's normal and it's okay that while young people are studying, they're living off 2-minute noodles. That should never be okay. Poverty shouldn't be considered a rite of passage for young people. We shouldn't ignore it, because the reality is, we just saw it on the statistics there. It's impacting how students enjoy their time at higher education. Something needs to be done about that, and I think this is the data set that starts that conversation and starts us thinking not what can we do for our students on campus, but how can we support them off campus.
Brilliant, thanks, Ngaire. Kath, I'm going to go to you next. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do. And I'm going to ask you a little bit from an Indigenous and equity point of view, because I know the work that you do with Access kind of touches on this. Reflecting on what you're hearing on the ground from underrepresented students around cost of living pressures. So tell us a bit about yourself and your reflections on that one.
Thank you. So my name's Kathleen Nelly. I am a Yamaji Noongar woman from the Western Australian regions, Midwest region of Geraldton and Perth inner regions. I'm a fourth-year student at Curtin University. I'm studying a Bachelor of Commerce in International Business and Anthropology and Sociology. It's not a double degree, it's a double major. And I started working at Curtin about 7 years ago as a project officer, and I moved around in the equity and diversity teams. And that sort of is how I came to know about NISHE, the National Centre, who has just been renamed as the Australian Centre for Student Equity and Success. And so I recently, in the start of the year, was appointed as an advisory board member, and it's been really interesting being on that sort of board. As someone that's always valued equity and diversity, it's very important that students' perspectives are shared on advisory boards like that. And so that's just a little bit about me. I'm also a regional kid, so grew up regionally, and very much advocate for Indigenous support for students at university and in primary schools and high schools as well. And what was the question again?
You covered it off really well. Now, we talked earlier about harmonisation between vet sector and universities, etc., the tertiary sector more broadly. But you came to university through TAFE, correct?
Yes.
You had some interesting reflections on that. Can you share what that journey was like for you?
Sure. So, like I said, I'm a regional kid, and I have been to 13 schools. I've been to 10 primary schools across Western Australia and 3 high schools. And so I've moved around quite a lot. And in that time, I've went to various different TAFEs and I guess you'd just call it institutes. I studied 5 different certificates because it wasn't by choice. It was just about what was available to me. And when you grow up in the regions, especially where I grew up in Tom Price in a mining town, the only thing accessible to you is mining. And so I did a resource and infrastructure certificate. I didn't want to do it, but what can you do? Like, it's there, it's free, so I did it. And I tried early childhood, then I tried business, and then I went into business again. And so I moved around and went to various different TAFEs, and to me it was the best experience. I'm always fortunate to be able to have that experience of TAFE. I was about 7 or 8 years of my life I studied while working full-time, and that was before I then did the transition into university, which took about 3 years before I actually thought maybe university might be for me. It was a real challenge because, my grandparents, they didn't have the opportunity to go to university. When we talk about sense of belonging, Indigenous people never belonged in university because we weren't allowed. And so that is a part of a challenge in terms of when we talk about having sense of belonging in places like TAFE and in universities. And I think it is a real challenge in terms of how students go about being in TAFE and then go into university. I did a Cert 4 in digital media and technology, and that to me opened a lot of doors because I applied for scholarships, and in 2016 I was the finalist for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Student of the Year for Bolton, and I became a top 4 finalist for the Australian Training Awards, where I was the top 4 of Western Australia Aboriginal Student of the Year. And then after that, I thought, okay, maybe I like this education thing. And so, yeah, I'm a real passionate person about TAFE and VET pathways.
Yep, it reminds me of my own journey. I think I only knew about university because my grandmother cleaned at one. And so I knew what one was because she explained it to me. And also she banked at one, so I managed to go on campus every now and then. But your journey was really important to you, facilitated by skills-focused education that led you to kind of pursuing a different pathway in education. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Kylie, as the executive representative here on the panel, I'm really interested from a university executive point of view, how are we grappling with these complexities and what keeps you up at night or gets you excited about the opportunities for you to do what you love in terms of fostering a really positive student experience?
Thanks, Braden, and I apologise for my voice, everybody. I think I've been talking too much the last few days, and it's letting me down at this critical moment. So thank you to Kath and to Ngaire for raising those concerns about student wellbeing, student safety. That's what keeps me up at night, actually, to think about how do I make sure that students get what they need to succeed, and what role I can play as a university executive to get the barriers, often unintentional, out of the way so that students can have a clear run through to what their goal is, whether that's a career goal, whether it's a learning goal, an educational goal, whatever success looks like for them. And I think the best way to do that is really to be actively listening and providing ways for students of all kinds, from national surveys through to advisory groups, through to sitting down with students, listening very actively and then acting on what you hear. So things that we have thought about and have really, I guess I feel like my feet are held to the fire by our student leaders in a really positive way. Because of them, we've been able to achieve a lot of interesting things. At our academic board this morning, our student members, there's 10, presented on cost of living impacts for them and what that means for them in terms of being able to achieve their goals. We have a student partnership agreement at UTS where the students' associations, we have 2, and the student representatives in different parts of the university document what they want to achieve together over a 2-year period. And then that's signed off and reported through the Student Council Liaison Group. We talked about governance before. We have about 15 students on that group. It's chaired by a member of our council. Students are really active in putting forward formal papers there, and in fact using every methodology that they can to make sure that their voices are heard, and I think we're lucky to have a really active set of student leaders in that way. We have a student SAF committee that is made up with students and staff that decides how our SAF funding is spent. We spent $1.6 million last year on food, free food and food subsidies for our students, so we recognise that that's a real and pressing thing. I think we can do a bit more in terms of making sure that our education in the classroom and beyond it is actually responsive to the kinds of pressures that students are feeling, that when a student comes onto campus, we've taken account of the travel that they have to do, the fact that they might have to set aside care responsibilities to be there, the fact that they can't work when they're there, So we're really actively trying to look at how can we manage things like our timetable to make sure that that it is more responsive to students' actual real lived experience right now, not something that we think might have happened in the past and maybe didn't even ever really happen. So there's a few of the things that keep me up at night. I'll have pause and then I'll tell you what makes me really excited about being at work.
Come back to the excitement piece. There are a lot of questions in there about the student experience survey, and a lot of them are around the kind of results or the methodology. I'm not really, as much as you want an answer to that, I think you can talk to Lisa about that. I really want to centre the student voice in this, so I'll try and capture that as much as I can. One of the questions is about the amount of emails that students get, and the amount of emails that students get specifically in regard to the student experience survey, and one provider has said our students complain about that a lot. What can we do about it? So I'm interested from a student's point of view first, so I don't know, Kath or Ngaire, whoever wants to take that one first.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's something that I raise quite a lot, especially in my, I guess, influence. Curtin recently just underwent a new learning and teaching strategy, and that was a key point that I put across as a student feedback, is that communication is key, is like we shouldn't be receiving the same information from 6 different areas about the same thing. It is quite overwhelming sometimes, and you can miss out on quite a lot of information. I think there is a way in which we can communicate with students, and I guess that's part of university's role in terms of creating policies and plans and putting that into place, and really trying to simplify things in a way that makes sense. And I was recently a part of a survey that our digital communications team did, and about 80% students said that they check communications through the general OASIS notification, and a lot of the students don't actually even read emails most of the time. And so I think it is an issue, and I think there could be a lot more done towards improving it.
Thanks, Kath. I know plenty of staff members and my colleagues who don't read emails as well, but so don't feel too bad about that.
Personally,
don't judge our students.
I read all my emails.
Okay.
I'm very organised.
You're better than I am.
And I respond to them all as well.
Great. I'll test you on that. Ngaire, your thoughts?
I read my emails too. Please don't send 9 emails reminding people to fill in the student feedback forms. If I didn't fill it out once I got the first 2, I'm certainly not going to be convinced by a 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th and 9th email. I think that there's this sort of like over-reliance on speaking to students through emails and signing students up to emailing lists they don't want to be on, and then saying, we can't take you off this, ha ha ha. Get tutors to speak to students in class. I had a capstone subject I did this semester where the last tutorial was quite literally, what did you all think about the subject? What would you want changed? How did you feel about it? Providing an in-class opportunity for students to fill that in, instead of, it cutting into students' personal times, being like, fill in our survey. It's, bring it back to sense of belonging, actually building an opportunity for communication and a pathway for listening face-to-face with your students, instead of hiding behind a computer screen. And I understand that there's a level of sort of, I don't know if it's a need for privacy, or if there are students who won't feel comfortable speaking to their tutor about it, any complaints they have. But as much as possible, trying to foster a sense of, personal connection, and actually feeling like there's a human on the other end who's listening to your feedback and is going to action it, not it going into an anonymised, data survey that you'll all look at in your academic board meetings and then go, oh, the students didn't like that course, let's cut it. That's sort of not the solution. The solution is build a dialogue and have a conversation face-to-face.
Thanks, Ngaire. Kylie, interested in your thoughts. Academics are super important in terms of student experience and how the sense of belonging is there, how they feel valued as individuals. What's the role of academics in fostering really relational ways of getting that feedback, but also making students feel seen in that process as well?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we've unintentionally set up is a kind of an industrial model to manage scale. And that's where that comes from. And then everyone wants to make sure that their service or their support area or whatever it is in front of students, not recognising that kind of receiver end. We've just done a look at how many emails students might receive from their letter of offer to census date. It's a couple of hundred. It's a lot. So that's not fun. So we're just really thinking about how to make that easier on students so that we have the clear messages cutting through and not everyone front-loading during that orientation and induction period, which is reflected in the survey data as well. So there's that part. But and this is where, for me, that kind of conversation that we've been having about generative AI assessment and humanness and human interaction starts to come to play, right? Because industrial models of assessment also distance students from academics, and we lose that relationship, which can exist in online learning as well. I feel like sometimes that gets a bad rap, but actually good quality, high quality, social, interactive online learning can work when we compare that to the emergency remote COVID response. That's a different thing. So we shouldn't just say compare one to the other because they're not the same. Anyway, back to the question, Braden. I really feel like people in roles like mine should be really thinking really carefully now about how to give academic staff headroom to do the thinking that they need to do to start thinking about what the university of the future looks like. Because we are facing really difficult times, right? We know that. Some of us immediately, some of us are looking into a 2 to 3 year pipeline going, we're not going to have as much. My fear, the second thing that keeps me up at night, is that the goals and intentions of the Accord will not be met because of short-term funding shortfalls, and that will take out the things that really support students to learn really effectively, and that will disproportionately affect students who come from underserved backgrounds. So that's my second sort of nightmare fear. My joy is that actually we have a really, we should move away from those tropes about students not wanting. We just had 2 students say, I read my emails, I'm engaged. That's my experience too. My hope for the future is grounded in our students because actually I think they're our way out of it. And the more we talk to them and the more we make time to talk to them and get to know them, the better off we are as institutions. So I think that's really where we need to be going in the future.
Great, thanks, Kylie. Lisa, now you're obviously the person who doesn't send out these emails, but is reliant on the insights coming back. What do you think? And then I'm going to ask you a tricky question because I think it was in Future Campus today, somebody said, QILT just leads to beige institutions across the sector. So I'll get you to go emails and then beige second, if that's all right.
Yeah, am I on? Yes. Yep. Tragically, we know that 9 emails work, sorry. We do badger everybody. But if you do it, they go away, or you can, it's got to get out of jail free. It does have a get out of jail free button.
Just hold the mic a bit closer.
That you can press. Oh, here we are. That you can press to get out. Like, you just have to unsubscribe. We'll stop bothering you. It's not hard. But the issue is, if students feel that they are shouting into the void, they will not do these surveys. They don't see the value. And why should they? So really, response rates and these kinds of surveys are really driven by institutions engaging with the results, engaging with their staff and engaging with their students and co-creating the solutions to what the surveys are pulling up. And where the surveys aren't asking the right questions, the sector can come together and pull together a module or pull together extra questions about, have you actually got a full-time job while you're studying, and is it related to your study? Those 2 questions would be really lovely to see in the student experience survey. The sector can add them. There's the government bit, but there's a sector bit that you can control. So to segue to the second part of your yes, I haven't had time to listen to the whole podcast. It happened when I was having a coffee coming here. But my impression is that it's a bit of a logical slide to say QILT is not working, we need to be designing a higher education system for the future and engaging with the world. Don't disagree with any of that. But QILT is only a set of 4 surveys. It can't measure everything. It is a set of indicators that are used in association with other indicators. So that can be attrition rates, it can be progression rates, it can be employment outcomes, which they weren't really talking about. There's a whole pile of indicators, and it depends on what you're wanting to drive. It depends on what you think is important to measure, what sits in those things. So I think yes, people have opinions. She says, someone's selling something, they'll have an opinion. I think it's a slide from talking about QILT to talking about the sector. And what they're saying about the sector, I agree with entirely. I mean, we need to be forward-looking. We need to be benchmarking with other countries. We need to be looking in particular at skills. So we've got a project to improve and review the employer satisfaction survey, which is, if you had any time to look at it, is about 500 skills questions, which may or may not be particularly meaningful. We want to go in and review those items and get together with Jobs and Skills Australia, Productivity Commission, employer groups, higher ed sector and students. What are the skills we need for the future? We should be measuring them and asking employers about them, and then feeding them back through the whole 4 surveys across the student life cycle. That's useful to higher ed. I think it's a much better way to go. So these things will evolve over time, but I think then saying it's dead, there's nothing useful in it, might be a slight overstatement.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Appreciate your response to that. I only got 5 minutes, so I'm going to get some short responses here. All of that data and all those insights that you saw, Kath, how do universities or providers make sure that students know that data firstly, but they're also responding to it? What for you would be the most significant thing they could do?
So for organisations to know about the data?
To share the data and make sure students know about it, but show that they're doing something about it and working with students to do something about it.
I'm a big advocate for visual learning. So anything about someone talking about something on a video or anything impactful, stories, newsletters, things like that, I will sit and listen to someone talk about how someone's been impacted by something. So if organisations want to highlight things like the survey, then I'd want to see that my feedback about my university experience is actually done something. Like, I want to know that when I say I don't feel like I have a sense of belonging at university, I want to know how that's being used. And so in terms of having data like this available, I think it's quite important for organisations to really highlight that yes, you are taking it into consideration, because what's the point in even advocating for students to fill it in if you're not going to tell students what you've done with the results that they've given to you? And so I think it's really important that each year, while you might send the survey report back to the students to say thanks for contributing, should really be highlighting it in a video or something to say that we've listened to you and we understand, and this is what we think has been done with your feedback.
Thanks, Kath. Ngaire, different question. Online, we know more students are opting for that because it's flexible, cost of living, needing to work, etc. From your point of view, how do we build really strong online communities and that sense of peer connect in the virtual environment?
That is an excellent question. For context, I'm a COVID student. I graduated high school in 2020, started uni in 2021. It's hard. It is hard, and I acknowledge that it's hard. It's a very good question. I think back to when I was in high school, and we switched to COVID, and that was a pretty seamless transition because this was a group of kids I'd been in the same classes with for, by that point, 6-7 years. I knew all my teachers. There was already that pre-existing, personal connection with everybody. So it kind of just sort of felt like, oh, cool, I'm still with these same people, but I can Zoom in from my bed. I think with university, the biggest hurdle to overcome is this is an unknown group of people, an unknown teacher. If you're a first year student, it's an unknown environment completely for you. I suppose I don't really have an answer other than to say, I think you just need to be conscious of the fact that these are kids who are in a new experience. This is as new for them as it is for the teachers. And it's trying in little ways to encourage connection outside of a Zoom classroom, or if possible, sort of being like, hey, I have office hours in person on this day, or if you can come into class, or you want to come into uni one day and just meet me, or even you want to sit in a room with me while I run the class on Zoom. Having those sorts of options available for students to opt into, and acknowledging that, like, as hard as I can imagine it is for a teacher to stare at a Zoom screen and have everybody there with their cameras off, because I always feel really guilty when I sit there and do that. I can imagine that's hard. But at the same time, for a student, it's just as hard to turn your camera on. Being mindful of that, creating the space and trying as much as possible to build connection, which is really a non-answer, but that's the best I got.
No, that's great. We've got 1 minute to go. I think 1 minute, am I getting that right? Yes. I would like one word that captures how you think the student experience is now, from your perspective. And then the second word is going to be how you think it needs to be. All right, so I'm gonna give you a little bit, but I'm gonna start with Lisa because she looked at me first. So, Lisa, how is it now? How does it need to be? 2 words, that's all you get.
Different and connected.
Great. Kylie?
I think it's functional and it needs to be relational.
Ngaire?
I didn't clock onto the fact that I was included in this. Oh, God. I think now it's very much the same as what you just said, Kylie, but we're separated and we need to be collective, be together.
Great. Kath?
Okay, I'm going to be really interesting. Disappointing, and it needs to be reciprocal.
Brilliant. Please thank our panel, everybody. So thank you to Ngaire, Lisa, Kath and Kylie. We are now going to break for afternoon tea, so we will see you back in here at 3:45. So thank you very much.